Hello, everyone, and welcome to our tour of the exhibition, Cornelia Hahn Oberlander, Genius Loci by Justine Jenkins. My name is Michael Magnuson. I'm the new public program and outreach coordinator at the Art Gallery of Alberta. To start this program, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. We are currently in the AGA building, which is in Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, the traditional land of diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Inuit, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe. We acknowledge and extend gratitude to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations and who continue to call this place home today. This tour is part of the public program for the exhibition Cornelia Hahn Oberlander, Genius Loci, curated by Amory Cavalli and Dr. Hilary Ledwin. This exhibition explores Oberlander's work to reveal connections that forge community and foster a deeper alignment with ecology and the natural environment. Featuring renowned works such as Robson Square, the National Gallery of Art, and the Legislative Assembly Building and Capitol site of the Northwest Territories. This is the very first hybrid program. We have people in the background, and we also have people watching Zoom and also Facebook. So that's really exciting. This tour will last roughly 1 hour with a Q&A at the end. One thing to mention for people attending virtually is that I will be moderating the chat. So if you have any questions for a Q&A, please use the Q&A function and we will try to answer them at the end. This AGA Live is made possible in part through support from the Heart and Soul Fund by EPCOR. And I would also like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts. Now I will introduce Justine Jenkins, our tour leader this evening. Justine Jenkins has over 25 years of experience in horticulture and environmental design and is an education coordinator at the University of Alberta Botanical Gardens. Their work includes education, design, and consultation for home and public installations. Their artistic practice in printmaking has a keen interest in intaglio mark making artistics and focuses on observation of our natural environment. Sorry, it's hard to say that word. So without further ado, here's Justine.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much to everybody who's watching. And thanks very much to the AGA for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'm really excited about design. I have had a diverse career and I'm really excited about some of the work that I did do at the University of Alberta Botanic Garden. I'm no longer there, but I was there at the university for 18 and a half years. And I'm kind of a plant nerd. So that's a positive thing, I think. I like being a plant nerd. So I'm interested in plants, but I also have graduated from OCAD University and studied environmental design there. So I do know about design and I have taught segments of design and I also have designed many things, but I'm very interested in how communities interact and intersect with our environments. And there's something that I've observed in Oberlander's work over the course of her 70-year career, and that is what I call a pattern language. Pattern language is something that really frames what I'd call the colloquial, and it makes people comfortable. And she was a genius with this, quite literally. We're blessed really to be able to actually see things that are so understated in the natural environment, but required a tremendous amount of intense research in order to get there. There's didactic panels and interpretation. And there's a really lovely gallery guide that's probably in the shop for sale, which is great reading. Just a little bit about details and souvenir. I know sometimes people come to things like this because they're interested in landscape design. They're designers, they're architects, they're public programmers. They may be interested in like social housing or perhaps just the environment in general. And then people are here sometimes just because they want to affect change or affect something interesting in their own personal world. And it has nothing to do with anything that may involve procuring a landscape architect to do that. So tonight I'd like to talk about things that will hopefully be of interest to you that may apply in some way, plants and people apply to your living and then other people's living. I hope that's what you'd like to listen to. And if you don't, please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions, and I'll try to answer any of those other questions as well. Okay, so maybe we'll just come into the gallery here, and we're going to kind of do this in a way that showcases some of the fantastic projects and some of the details. Now, every once in a while, I'll talk a little bit more about plants specifically. So if anyone grows plants, or would like to grow plants, I have a lot of background growing plants, so I can certainly help you with those specific things. But then I'm going to talk a little bit about design and some of the things that, which I personally think are genius, and perhaps mindfully, if we could come into partnership with our built environments and consider these things as people in our community, I think it would help our living in the city. So I'm hoping that that's reasonable. When we talk about some projects, and you can look at the exhibit yourself, I mean, many people have come and seen this exhibit more than once. I've run into people more than once in the exhibit myself, and I'm taking fervent notes and writing things and going back and coming back. And I create a little bit of attention just because I'm looking at things in such fine detail. But one thing I really love about this particular project is Cornelia was really a champion for people, but people who lived in a place where how can we make something wonderful out of the place that we have? And I find sometimes we don't always do that in our modern living. In 2021, well, maybe the pandemic did this for us. We had to kind of make something great out of what we have instead of always looking at something else being better than what we have. And one of those projects that's just phenomenal is this neighborhood playground that was designed in Philadelphia. And one thing that I just wanted to say was she had this amazing attention to detail that is integrated lots of aspectual things about living that didn't have just to do with, it's called a playground. So we often think about playgrounds as places where children go. So I think about a modern tot lot, and this is a bit of a criticism, but you send your kids there, and you sit on a park bench, and the kids go on to prefab, playground equipment, and then you're bored and hardly waiting for them to leave. Like, are we bored yet? Can we go home? And these playgrounds were designed so that people could interact of all ages, all backgrounds, and basically had complete respite in the city. So the idea of providing respite to people, it was really a huge goal of hers. Doesn't matter about your social background, doesn't matter about how much money you have, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. She designed for people in general. And one thing about this project that I absolutely love is that she had places for people to actually play games, but people could have, if you were adults, you could play games. So you could hang around and you could go and play chess, or you could play other games. And then there were play areas. And a lot of times what she ended up doing is implementing what she would call like a junkyard playground into a space, which is amazing. And built forms that were just replications of something in nature, but there were no directions. Like if you want to use a teeter-totter, you basically have, gravity and someone across from you. It's just, that's the way the teeter-totter works, or a swing works. But a lot of her built forms for children were very much spontaneous and sort of indirectly guiding children towards their own self-discovery and development, which was something that I think if we could all guide ourselves to our own self-discovery and just wonder in our natural world and natural world within the city, and a sense of respite in a place, I think that's a good goal to have if we're thinking about the things we want out of the city we live in. Edmonton is anticipating another 1 million people to come into this footprint, and the footprint can't just expand indefinitely. It's going to be a place that has to be usable, and people will have less personal space and more communal space. And so I guess what this plays to is a thought about How does that communal space that's built in very small areas, how is it socially equitable and developmentally equitable for everyone who uses it? And that's a thought. It's not just about children, it's just a thought. Okay, and this is an example of some of her research. She was amazing at her research and she did lots of research. And then when she implemented things that were totally incredible, but also gave a situation where it seemed almost like it was effortless. And that's something that I find really fantastic. One project that I really want to focus on too is the creative space for play. And this project here, for one thing, if I, as a printmaker, if nobody minds, I'm just gonna come over and talk about these prints. These design prints, I know, here's my big, huge nerd. The color in these are just phenomenal. This printing, this is like a blueprints, like an old school brown print that's colored, but also partially hand rendered, and just a phenomenal, for its own sake, piece of art. It's incredible. But one thing about this project, the Canadian Government Pavilion Children's Creative Play Garden, that was just amazing in my mind is the use of an ability to implement a space that she called a vest pocket, like a vest pocket park. So basically you have a vacant lot somewhere, build a park. I'm gonna this is a question you don't have to answer, but if you could stick it in the back of your mind and think about it, when you're traveling through Edmonton on your bicycle, public transit, or your car, you can't find a place to park. The best thing about it is, how many times do we stop and there's a little tiny area that's just a vacant park? And wouldn't that be great if there was a garden or a park there? Just a little space that's this big, and there are trees and a place and respite and benches. It would be a different city. So it's something about the way she thought things could get scaled up or scaled down anywhere. This is a plan, of course. So this is plan that shows, different areas based on age, which is quite interesting. And the interesting thing I also felt was there was a nursery area that was enclosed, and that was for, safety. You could leave a 4-year-old in there and nothing would happen to them really, probably. Okay, and they were free to explore. So what's in there? Sand. There's also, hedges, and then there's also trees. The scale of trees are something that I find really interesting. The full scale trees in these designs, so this is like obviously an elevation drawing or actually a perspective drawing of that plan to scale, has the area where there's a viewing platform for the pavilion, so you could be a casual interactor in this space, but still gain some respite from the trees and the green area, and then also the built forms. And it's pleasing, so it's a pleasing space, but it's the world in miniature. And there's a couple of examples of world in miniature that I want to talk about, because that's something that's, when people are trying to design landscapes, I think what they do is they often say, okay, make a list of the plants that you like. I want a native garden, I want a pollinator garden, or an indigenous garden, or something where the plants are native, or this is naturalized, or it's a cottage garden, or there's certain types of garden design. And that's fantastic, but it's also a matter of saying, how do we create a small world in miniature so that we can have a lovely place of respite for ourselves? And that pattern language where you pick up on colloquial things that make people comfortable, inherently you're going to find a way to provide respite. And one of the things that Cornelia did that was completely genius was, instead of taking a park, which we find an awful lot, that has trees lining the outside and a huge expanse of lawn, and there's nothing on the inside, she created sort of a focal point where the trees provide respite in the center of the space, and then everything flows from the outside of that, which is something that makes it so that you could play under there and feel respite, but you could also be along the edges of this and feel some sense of respite. It's a place where you feel safe, comfortable, and it's a small scale design, small scale in the sense that it can be sized up or sized down. And it's really adaptable for lots of different types of uses and that sort of comfortable feeling for all the users. One thing about this project that I absolutely love is this slope in the Sandbox area. So I don't know if any of you have children or you've probably been a child yourself, but most children love to climb all over everything. So really, literally, she would take the natural terrain and she would actually implement, you know, a sloped retaining wall many times in her designs that would create a place where somebody wanted to climb up. So often Cornelia was a genius for working with the typography as it existed, rather than altering the typography and saying, well, there's like a huge slope here and let's just level the site. And somebody would say, some other person would say, yes, exactly. Like the slope would be a hindrance and it's impossible to grade or build into, but she would capitalize on that. And there's a private residence later on in the exhibition that shows that, which is really quite a genius way to draw people into what others might consider to be a disadvantage, but was quite phenomenal. This project here is probably the most exciting project in this exhibition for me. And there's some things that I find just completely amazing. The East 3 School is located 2 degrees above the Arctic Circle. And it's built on permafrost. So there's a series of pilings in which the buildings anchor down into the ground. Climate change is a real huge factor in the design of this and the building of this. And this is an Indigenous garden and school space. We all know, though, in isolated communities, people have to use a school for other things. So the design of this school was for all over development for the students there. So Cornelia was, she did amazing things where she would put in a berry patch. She would put in things where berry picking was something that you could do. But it was also a community gathering space where certain aspects of, gathering of community, education from elders, consultation with elders was something that she did in her design process and research gathering, but it was also something that would be past school, the timeline of a typical school day. So the entire community could use the space. One thing that's amazing about the trees was she got permission to actually collect seeds and cuttings and trees that have what we call in the green world provenance. So you always want to put something in a landscape that has the same provenance or a provenance that can withstand the conditions in which it's being grown and where you live. So what she did was she grew on these plants and then took them from the nursery. So she'd take cuttings, grew them on for 2 years, and then they were installed in this project. So they're from the place. The trees had all the roots cut. They were cut 2 years before the installation. So it was a situation where that is something that is from a site, is carefully obtained from its natural environment. Its provenance is of a place similar, so then it goes back into a place similar. It's like saying, I would like a brand new tree in my yard, but it's grown in Oregon and it's zone 5 or something, and we live in zone 4, and it's borderline hardy anyway, and it's awfully dry here, and there's other conditions that make it very difficult to transplant. But if you grew a tree down the road and it had a provenance, so the seed and or the cuttings and or any type of propagation for that, if it was a perennial, if the provenance is from this place or a place that's similar in latitude or elevation or harshness of environment, and then you turn around and install it in a place that's new, chances are that's going to be very successful when you put it into the place that you want to grow into. And so she was a pioneer that thought ahead of her time. Many people, when they're sourcing plant material, don't do that. Universities do that. Work at the university and other botanic gardens in Canada do it all the time. So I do know that people at UBC Botanic Garden do that. Other people who do collections management, botanic gardens from all over the world actually do that. So where's the provenance? Where did that seed come from if it was grown from seed? If it's grown at an elevation or an environment that's similar to the one you're planting into, chances are that seed is more successful. The worst thing you can do in such a harsh environment is try to put something in there, and it's such a benchmark and pivot point for the community, and then it doesn't work. So this is a really important point. Now, some things that Cornelia did, and this is a sort of her, like her, you know, her research-based conversations about what she was doing, which is phenomenal, was she had like social studies, sort of generally, the natural settings, and how to learn with elders, because she worked with elders. And this is something that people do all the time now, but this was 2007. This is a significant period of time ago in our living. And this is super helpful, because if you consult with community groups that actually know something about the history of use of the plants, then that ethnobotany gets translated into that social fabric. And that social fabric is the children and everyone else in the community who needs to learn and garner from that rich knowledge. And it's actually in the site, which helps everyone. Now, some of the plants that are just fantastic that can be grown in Edmonton that I wanted to kind of talk about here, like for instance, if you're looking for trees that you want to install, the Picea glauca is the white spruce. And, you know, it's like, some people might say it's not the most flattering of all spruce, but it is endemic to Western Canada. So it's something that you might want to consider. And then of course, Larix laricina, which is like larch, that's a deciduous conifer that drops its needles. That loves to be grown in this area. We have Rosa sicularis, which is native. And then also different types of species, Schipperdia canadensis, which is a soap berry. So it actually, the fruit on the berry actually produces a soap or a lather. Saponin is in that. And then also blueberries and cranberries. So fruits, small fruits. Part of the learning and connecting with community was berry picking was part of that curriculum, adapted to social interaction and recreation, which is quite interesting. And then of course, grasses. One of my favorite plants on her list is Arctostaphylos ursi, which is bearberry. And you can find that in the Canadian Rockies. It's an important medicinal plant. And it's a low growing ericaceous evergreen ground cover, which is really lovely. So some of those plants are really great if you're looking on putting plants in your own garden and you think, I'd like to source these and I don't know what to grow that is endemic to this area. Some of these plants on this list can grow in your garden in Edmonton. So if you're looking to put in a naturalized landscape, that's definitely worth a list to look at. This project here, the Skeena Terrace low rent housing project, and the reason the word low rent is kind of something that makes me nervous, in the sense that I don't know whether people should be referred to as being able to pay less rent than other people. But the nice thing about this project is, and maybe that term was coined and given, so it's nothing you can control. But one thing that was fantastic about this was the use of plant material to create in social housing, to create courtyards and to create access to food plants, which we find all the time. This project was built and this project was built and it is basically intact as it was built. So in this advocating landscape, it was designed for marginalized people to have access to housing that created a a green and lush place where the concept of having your actual own backyard might not be something that people have ever been used to. But when there is a sense of respite and a place for someone, that sense of place creates more comfort, and it also helps create a bridge between, you know, having a situation where you lack and it's inhospitable, and you are in a place of comfort, and it is more natural for you to feel that you actually are a living being in a place where perhaps much of your life might have been not so hospitable. So it's really interesting how these areas here, where you see all of these areas here, this is areas where we have areas where there's certain like little spaces. They're offset from each other and they're designed physically so that there's a sense of some privacy, which is perhaps unheard of when we're trying to design apartments, but then also corridors of green and access to food plants. Food plants, shade, respite, gathering places. That is perhaps we should be thinking of trying to implement that more, so that if we have shared spaces, that shared space is not just beautiful, but also useful. And it also provides for people who perhaps have less than others. So it's something that I really love about the way she worked. Now, this project was built in 1965, so it's almost 56 years old, which is, it sounds like something you see more in our choices in 2021, but in 1965, it was something that people were on the edge of discovering as something that would be actually truly helpful to the human condition, which I am truly inspired by. So we'll come over and we'll talk a little bit more, if that's okay, about all of these things. Now, there might be some of these projects I touch on a little bit more than a little bit less. I feel that one interesting thing about this place here is the Portland Hotel Public Housing Project was designed with Arthur Erickson, famous Canadian architect. But one thing that was really lovely about this was the use of the courtyard as a space where people could gather. So that created an inclusive place where people could gather, and also a sense of respite for the areas. There's an expansive staircase between areas here where people could go and actually, you know, use of expansion in built forms creates a sense of luxury for most human beings, which was almost ill-afforded most of the time. I mean, we follow building codes and we have to have a minimum space so two people can pass. So I can go up and you can come down. But this was designed so that there was quite an expansive place for people to be able to actually interact, which is sort of unheard of in an urban setting. So that's really quite lovely. You can see here in this hand rendering, it's really lovely. We have, you know, a bridge area. There is a place for growing plants like herbs for social housing for people to use so they could cook. They could actually implement their own food and communal space like sharing. And also areas of, in here we had apples, okay? And then, apples and plums were implemented in the design. And that's also food gathering. So people who are perhaps on a tight budget, don't have a lot of access to fresh food, maybe live in a food desert, which happens a lot in Edmonton. There's no access to fresh food, or it's very expensive. She implemented these things in design so that people had access, so you could use the food, and chance as it were that you could grow the food and have a place where you could gather, which is very useful to people. I'm just going to touch very quickly on this public housing project, because the nice thing about this was, again, public housing project that's a little bit more advanced in the sense that the idea, again, Cornelia really worked on was the idea that even though it was a communal space, it was like you had your own yard. So some of the plants that, some of these plants, some of the species of these plants won't grow here, but there's certain things that are really super tough and hardy that if you're looking for things to implement into your own natural landscapes and you're thinking, I need something bulletproof, some of the things that could be grown here, like from the point of view of their genus rather than just their species that she's got on her list that I really like are, and definitely worth a try. There's lots of different kinds of roses here. So they were grown for scent, you know, and also their beauty. So Canada is home to one of the, I would suggest that modern rose breeding in Canada is probably the most prolific in the world. So we have some of the most interesting and hardy roses in the world being bred right now in Canada, and they have been bred in Canada for a significant period of time. So there's a huge plethora to bank yourself on, and it might be something that people don't often think about as a plant. So flowering shrubs, and then also we have different kinds of honeysuckle, but one honeysuckle that climbs that's lovely and worth a try is the Dropmore Scarlet honeysuckle, which was actually bred by the Skinner family in Manitoba. So it's a Canadian bred honeysuckle and it attracts hummingbirds. And then also we have different types of pines. Pines also are extremely drought tolerant. So they need a lot of sun and they're also extremely drought tolerant. So if you're looking for ways to implement things in the landscape, don't need tons of water. That's definitely something that you might want to consider. Also, if your plants are mulched, they require 30% less water. 30%? Yeah, minimum 30% less water if they're mulched. So if you belong to a tree planting group and you're trying to revitalize natural areas, if those trees are mulched, they're at least 50% more likely to transplant because they're mulched. All you have to do is just put a little bit of mulch around the root system and water them in, and you'd be surprised. Now, I'd like people to plant trees differently than that, but I'm just saying from a bare minimum. It's like a bare minimum, okay? If anyone has questions about tree planting. Oh yeah, absolutely. Like this was 1954, which is totally phenomenal. You know, like it's just, it seems timeless. You know, it's timeless. And then of course, this project here was 1955 and it seems timeless. So in 2021, we might need to look back at some of the innovative things in order to help ourselves remember our common human history and how there was some very innovative things being done. We're going to talk about more innovative things just right over here. So if you want to join me, we'll go over here. We'll talk about more innovative things. We're going to talk about this house because this is pretty amazing. Does everybody want to come right in? We'll have everyone come right in. That way everybody feels like they can actually see this photograph and these drawings. Okay, so this is a classic example of how design was approached with what existed. Okay, so this landscape, there's a couple things going on here that I find totally phenomenal. Okay, and it is, the house was built and the landscape had a tremendous rise on one side of it. Okay, now it's hard to sort of see, however, that's the front door on the lower level of the house. So you'd come in the gravel drive and you'd go in here. Now, a lot of people would say, what on earth why would you do that? Well, research has shown, and from interviewing and looking at the design drawings and everything else, This was built like this because this was clay and hard pan. And to get an excavator in there in order to level out that site would have been a complete nightmare and a huge cost. So when a design gives you a problem, the problem gives you a creative answer. So sometimes when you have a creative answer for that, it's just phenomenal. So in this case, one thing that's interesting about this planting here, though, is this is planted sort of like the waves of the ocean. It just cascades down a waterfall. The shrubs are planted just like this, so they create a rhythm. And you don't really realize it until you're standing there that you go, oh, that's so relaxing, isn't it? So a concept in nature is borrowed in the form, which sounds like a strange thing to say. So there's a pattern in the form that is borrowed from some other natural phenomenon. And this is, we see this in Japanese garden design, where the world is built in miniature, and then there's rocks and sky and clouds and parts of the natural world that are sculpted into the plants. But the application of this, where there's a cascading planting that is just a pattern language, the average person standing there says to themselves, I'm not sure why I feel so comfortable here. And it's because those are replicating a cascading waterfall on the edge of a slope in plant material that creates the scale and rhythm that your body says, oh, that's just like the water. It's created from a lot of research and a lot of intuition, which you don't always recognize. But there are things about stuff that you love and you think, well, I live in the middle of a landlocked place with no water. How does it, and I love the water. Well, you have to work with what you have. In this case, it was a flaw that was capitalized on in a built manner, which I find intriguing. And I do believe that landscape is still intact. So over all that time, it's still.
Any idea what the shrub is?
Yeah, actually, I think it's right here. Sorry. You know what? I'm very sorry, because on this initial design drawing that she just has the shrubs and the scale of them, but she doesn't actually have the plant list on this. So I'm sorry. And on this print here, there's actually not a key for the shrub list. So I'm sorry. But you know what? It might be something, because this is on the West Coast. This might be something that can't be necessarily grown here, but there's lots of plant material that could be grown. Well, if it was sort of a shady site, I'd probably put in maybe a low bush cranberry. Okay, so that's deciduous. But you could also put in cedar, although eventually the cedar would grow really quite large. So you might have to adapt the number of rows that you would, depending on the spread of something. It's hard for me to say exactly how many. So for instance, if you had something that was this big when it was sculpted, if you had something that grew naturally in that shape, that's something that I would pick. You could shear it, of course, and design it that way. But the thing about it is if it ends up growing, to this size, then all I would say is adapt that for its scale implementation. So you'd say to yourself, okay, I'm going to make a decision. If that design normally had 40 shrubs installed, I might be able to replicate that by installing like a third less of the plant material. So there's a few things you could do. If you wanted it to be evergreen, that would be lovely, but it depends on the site itself and whether or not there's shade. And I don't know exactly, unfortunately, even north is this direction, so that is north. So I would suggest that you could put something in there that's, I think that would be then that would be north. That would be east, and that would be quite a bit of shade because there's a rise there. So the morning sun would only hit part of that. But it would require a little bit of, it's also very heavy soil. So you might have to very carefully pick the right plant. And I'm sorry that I don't know what's installed there. Okay, yet you're welcome. Does anybody else have any quick questions before we move on? No, we're okay? Okay. 5 more minutes? Yeah. Okay, no problem at all. There's just 2 things I really wanted to talk about. Again, I don't want to go over like these estates that were the best thing about this project here is the changes in the elevation for each individual lot. So this doesn't have as much information in it. I guess what I wanted to quickly talk about here is some of the plant materials. So one of the things that Cornelia installed in these plant materials that aren't used as much in Edmonton but are fully hardy are rhododendrons. And I just wanted to talk about, there's a series of rhododendrons that were developed by the University of Helsinki in Finland, and they're extremely hardy in Edmonton. So they have a really extensive collection. And that's one thing about plant material I wanted to talk about in here. So a lot of people don't install them, but they should perhaps more often. Okay, the number one thing I want to talk about in this project is the approach from the site. So the line of sight to scale, I don't know if you can see this. This is the person who's here. And then at different times of year, depending on whether the trees have lost their leaves, you can see all the way across the whole entire site. So Cornelia was famous for taking a site, even if it was extremely flat, and making it extremely interesting without changes in the terrain, and actually putting in texture, color, and different leaf patterns so that depending on the type of time of year, if you had a line of sight, you could see the whole site over a long expanse, and you could actually see the changes in seasonality, which would be super interesting. The reason why I picked that up is because we live on the prairies, and that's a contrast to the other site where this is extremely flat. And then one thing I think I want to talk about next, just because we're almost running out of time, but this is actually a really important project. And this is the Northwest Territories Legislative Building. And there's the thing that Cornelia did with this was something that she referred to as like mending the natural environment. So we've all been on construction sites. Well, maybe some of us haven't been, but we have been on construction sites where we have, you know, a huge expanse of earth that's upheaval. It's an upheaval of earth, and then we put a building in there. And then if it's a place like the Northwest Territories where you can see something's on the site, we own this much land, this is the lot size, and then the natural environment is all around this. She was a pioneer in dealing with situations where she would actually actively repair the edges of a site so that it was almost indiscernible. You wouldn't even know that the building was there. So often it was there. Not all of her projects are here, of course, but many of her projects were thoughtfully researched, but they were focused upon because the focus on her work was, I meant to say, sorry, is that there is a knitting together of almost like fabric between a tear in the landscape where you disturbed it, and then the fringes of the landscape where it becomes almost one, which is pretty amazing. So, and this building was built specifically like that, but I'm running a bit out of time, and I do want to capture as many questions as possible. And if somebody wants to talk about other of the designs that I've just touched on slightly, please feel free. Please feel free.
Great. I'm just turning on my mic here.
Just so we can get everybody's questions, even people on Zoom.
Yeah,
Yes.
so basically, if you have any questions, I'm going to repeat your questions. And right now, We have no questions in the chat. So if you have any questions here for Justine, please go ahead.
Can anybody tell me, if somebody doesn't have a question, can anybody tell me what their interest is? Like, you came here for a reason. Does anybody want to share what their interest is or something that they want to learn? Yes.
I'm just a little curious about water management, talking about the West Coast and having a slope right beside your house, made of clay, and it rains on the West Coast. You know, how do they use plants to mitigate sort of the water runoff and flow? And here in Edmonton, of course, how we can you know, make use of what water we do get using that landscape.
Well, it's really interesting. Plants actually capture a lot of water. And a lot of people don't think about that. They just think about runoff and soil erosion, but plants do actually capture a lot of water. And we didn't talk at any extensive length about Vancouver Public Library project, where Cornelia actually installed a really important living roof. And green roofs are being installed everywhere now. She actually wrote a manual for the Canadian government for green roof installation. So when we think about heat island effect and also slopes and water mitigation, I do find that even if you do have a lot of runoff and it's right next to your house, if you look at the picture, it's not so obvious from the photograph, but what happens is the slope comes down, but then it comes this way. So it comes down in this way, and so it's brought away from the foundation. I mean, there are French drain systems that can be installed in order to help. And I'm not going to say run the water off your property. You shouldn't really run any water off your property. You should try to capture all that water and actually divert it back into the system. So at some point, water will find level, and hopefully somewhere in your grading, you end up finding somewhat level so that all that plant material is actually capturing that water and it's not running off and into the storm sewer or the city sewer system, if you can possibly do it. Okay, so plants are great for that. They want the water, the 3 drops of water that we have. Hopefully we get some more, but yes. I hope, does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Is anybody else working on a project they're really interested in asking about? Like they want to plant a tree or put in a pollinator garden or?
Well, I'd love to know more about the rhododendrons.
Yes, actually, the University of Helsinki in Finland is zone 4. The nice thing they have going for them is, of course, they have moisture, but of course, there are standard rhodos that grow here that you can put in sheltered spots, but the ones that have been developed and released for cultivation, they have hundreds of them on their site, their growing site at the university, but they've released some so that they're for sale. And they're slow growing, but in sheltered spots in Edmonton, they're faring just fine. I have 2 in my yard and they both bloom this spring. These are about 4 or 5 feet, but it depends on the cultivar. Depends on the cultivar.
Once you see them like in Victoria,
Mhm.
you think, why would I even try?
Yeah, the thing is, they won't grow 2 stories high here, but you know, I actually have someone I know who has a rhododendron touching their soffit of their house, their bungalow. So it's that big, but it's been there for 40 years. So once you get them established, if they're in a sheltered spot where there's snow cover and not a lot of desiccating winds, you'd be surprised at what you can plant.
I have a question from our lovely Zoom. Can her playground design be built in Edmonton with the city's liability concerns?
Well, I think the thing that's interesting is they can be built in Edmonton with the city's liability concerns. And of course, I think that's the thing about 2021 playground management. You could build a site with you could certainly build a site with plants in it that is designed in a way that provides respite, where there's not necessarily just like 1 or 2 token trees around a tot lot with a sandbox. You could certainly do that. Could you build something that is made out of you'd have to change your materials under the city guidelines.
Mhm.
So for public safety, you'd have to change the materials because we're talking about 2021. So there's going to be things that are built that actually require less. Like you could build a climbing wall of some kind, and you could build a slope climbing wall or a climbing. I'm going to say if you build a raised wall that's even lower than, which is a building code requirement for a railing, and it's stepped, children will climb all over it. Like it just, and then if you had some, some land and plantings and another rise, you could create something creatively that's not necessarily built exactly the same way, but you have to be quite creative about it. But I do believe you certainly could take many of the aspectual ideas that Cornelia is using and actually adapt them to a little tiny small spot in Edmonton. Absolutely.
Okay. That sounds fantastic. I have another question from Facebook. This question is from Susanna. What
Yes.
would you say were the most distinctive features of her design, from your opinion?
I'm going to say the most distinctive features were the understated quality of her designs. Very understated. And it seemed almost like effortless. Very natural, very effortless, very calming, and very unassuming. But a lot of research went into them.
Mhm.
So those are the key things I think I see. Does
Yeah.
anyone else think of these designs differently? Would they like to share something they think about Cornelia's designs that?
Well, I didn't know anything about her until I read a full page obituary because she just passed away in the spring in the Globe and Mail. And they mentioned that she was responsible for when you walk on the beach in Vancouver, all the large logs that they use for seating that are just randomly on the beach. She was responsible for that. I just thought it's brilliant.
It's something that's already there.
Yes.
Something that's already there. It belongs in our natural environment. It's right in front of you. And it's somewhere, in a pattern language, a low wall is somewhere where people will either play or sit. So if you wanted to build this in Edmonton and you built a low wall that was stepped in 2 levels, but it didn't require a railing, it was low enough, everyone with a coffee will sit and all their children will climb and clamber all over. And if it's built or it's logs, they'll go there and they'll sit. So we're not in Vancouver and there is no beach, but there's accidental beach, but there's no real beach, but there's a place. There's a place gathering. Yes. And it's from something that's actually just there.
And if you think about how important having a bit of green space and respite has been through the pandemic, and people that don't in these projects that she created.
It's for everyone.
It's been there for years.
Yes, the green is there for everyone, and the green should be there for everyone. That's why she called things a vest pocket park. She called it a vest pocket park. So it's like this big, and it's just in this small space in the city. I mean, there's a bus turnaround just north of here, and it's phenomenal. The trees are phenomenal. It's a really nice place to sit. It's just up the street. City Hall's over on the west. They're on new buildings here, and it's a bus parking lot turnaround. It's a really nice place to sit. So little things like that need to sort of be thought of about where we live. And if you live in a condo and you don't have your own space, but you have the ability to impact that space and you live somewhere, you should try to impact the space so that sharing quality is available to all the people who live there.
I have another question from Facebook.
Yes.
It's a planting question. We heard that Collimar crab apple trees would work well in Edmonton. Is that true? Collimar crab apple trees.
Yeah,
Have you heard
they
of that?
certainly will. Yeah, they certainly will. But you've got to remember that when you buy them in a container, they look like this. They look like they'll take up a footprint of a dining room chair. but they're actually gonna grow like this big.
Okay. good to
So
know.
don't have it block your front walkway.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they do have they are tall and slim. They have a fat, what we call a fasket form, but they still will just this big space. So don't plant them, you know, like 1.5 meters on center. It's just gonna be like blocking your whole
Okay.
space.
Great.
But
Well,
yes.
we have time for one more question. Is there any question from the audience here since you guys came down? Okay.
I know you're, that I came late and I know.
Oh, it's okay.
About the geography, right? I'm curious, how's the geography in Vancouver? What makes it really different than the geography in Edmonton?
Oh, the geography in Vancouver?
Yeah.
Okay, I think the thing about urban density, it's quite dense city. So there's people who don't have a lot of personal space, and if they do, it's super expensive. So it's super expensive here too, but it's like a lot more, yes. And then, but it's very green. And then you're basically have mountains around you and the Pacific Ocean. And so, and really the Pacific Ocean is sort of right there in the city. So there are small islands that people live on and also the city. And it's also quite, it's not flat. Like I find Edmonton's relatively flattish city. I mean, it's not as flat when you go into the river valley like this from the north or from the south. But other than that, Edmonton's kind of a flattish city. And the trees are a lot like bigger from a hugging point of view.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's it for our lovely tour. Thank you so much, Justine. It truly was
I had
enlightening and
such a fun time.
it was a blast for us as well. I'm just going to let people know that we have a little survey that you can fill out. Our
Please do.
gallery attendant is going to come around with a piece of paper and a pencil. And this is truly fabulous. And thank you so much for
Oh,
being
you're
here.
welcome. I'm really pleased to be asked. It's a privilege to be asked. I really appreciate it and the opportunity to be asked. I love plants and I love nature and I love that feeling that people feel when they just are immersed in their natural world and they have appreciation for it. And that they feel positive about planting things and growing things and coming together and having a beautiful place to live.
Mhm.
So thanks for having
Yeah.
me.
And before we clap for Justine, I also want to shout out Helen. And
Thank
we
you,
also
Helen.
have Sarah, who worked on this exhibition.
Thank you,
So let's all
Sarah.
clap for everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for attending, everyone. Okay, and that concludes our tour. So take a gander around, and we also have surveys that you can fill out.
And please give feedback because someone will give me feedback. So if you think something's was not the greatest, just let them know so I can make it better. I would like to do that just because